Chapter 12, Topics 12.1 and 12.2, Defense Mechanisms of the Host and Perspective, and an overview of the second and third lines of defense. The topic objectives for these two topics are: summarize what the three lines of defense are, identify three components of the first line of defense, identify marker and discuss its importance in the second and third lines of defense, name four body compartments that participate in immunity, list the components of the reticular endothelial system, define the structure and function of the lymphatic system, name three kinds of blood cells that function in nonspecific immunity and the most important function of each, and name two kinds of lymphocytes involved in specific immunity. In these two topics, we're going to be covering the concept of immunity, the first line of defense, specifically skin and mucous membranes, and the second line of defense.
Under the topic of the concept of immunity, we're going to talk about innate immunity, adaptive immunity, toll-like receptors, or TLRs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or PAMPs, and cytokines. Now, but previous to this, especially in the previous two chapters, we've been talking about how pathogens get past our defenses and cause us disease. Now we're going to talk about immunity, which is how we fight pathogens, how we fight the foreign invaders. Now, immunity comes in two parts: innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Innate immunity is with us as soon as we're born, and it kicks in even if we haven't been exposed to that particular pathogen. Adaptive immunity is the immunity that we get when we've been exposed to that particular pathogen or that particular antigen. So we're going to talk about adaptive immunity more in the next chapter, but the two are intertwined. So in innate immunity, we have on our immune cells that are part of the innate immune system toll-like receptors. Now you can kind of think of this as a toll bridge. That's not where the name comes from, but you have a toll road, and so they check everything that comes through and gets the tolls. But what they're checking for are pathogen-associated molecular patterns, things that we never see in our body, things that are always going to be foreign. Now, this is where it becomes apparent why I made you learn different molecules that are in microbes, things that are never seen in us. So take a few seconds, think about what kinds of things are seen in, say, bacteria, fungus, protozoa, algae, that are never seen in the human body. That would be peptidoglycan, because we never see peptidoglycan in anything but bacteria. So that would be a PAMF. That would be a pathogen-associated molecular pattern because it's never seen in mammals and humans. Chitin. We never have chitin produced in our body. So if we see chitin, we know there's a fungus there, and we can attack it. If we see cellulose, algae usually isn't a problem in humans, but if it was, then our immune system is set up to immediately attack it. So all of these things that we never see in humans are PAMPs. Your innate immune system automatically recognizes these things. Now, because the innate immune system is already set up to recognize these PAMPs, it's a whole lot quicker than the adaptive immune system. It can respond immediately as soon as these PAMPs are recognized. With adaptive immunity, for a first exposure, it can take up to usually about 3 days. Sometimes it's up to a week. It depends upon what the antigen looks like. So the innate immune system is more rapid, it's immediate, it's innate, inborn, and the adaptive immunity is a little slower, but you have memory. Once you've been exposed to that particular antigen, your body recognizes it when it sees it again. It's specific. It's specific for the particular pathogen that you yourself have been exposed to. So those are the overall characteristics of the innate and adaptive immune systems. Now on to cytokines. Cytokines are molecules that immune cells use to talk to each other. and they regulate the intensity and duration of immune responses. And their functions are to recruit other immune cells, specifically macrophages and dendritic cells. We're going to talk about those more later on in the chapter. They cause inflammation. We're also going to be talking more about that. And to activate T cells and B cells. In other words, T cells and B cells are part of the adaptive immune system, so they activate the adaptive immune system when the innate immune system has been stimulated. Now we're going to talk about your first line of defense in the innate immune system, specifically skin and mucous membranes. We're going to talk about physical factors that are part of your first line of defense, chemical factors, normal microbiota, and how it relates to your innate immune system. Let's talk about a little bit of anatomy. Okay, the skin comes in several layers. You have your dermal layer where you have live cells that are constantly moving up, and then they form your epidermis. Now your epidermis, you can see from this micrograph that the cells are a whole lot flatter than they are down in the dermal layer. As the epithelial or skin cells move up into the epidermis, they become flatter, more keratinized. Keratin is a protein. Then when you get a lot of it, it's waterproof, and it's very hard to digest if you're a microbe. And as they move up, they become more keratinized and eventually die. So the upper layer of your epidermis is several layers thick of dead waterproof cells. This makes a wonderful physical barrier. Now you do have to have communication with the outside and the inside of your skin. So we have pores, we have hair follicles that come through. You also produce, you have pores that produce sweat that help in cooling the body. But all of these are physical factors, and when we talk more about chemical factors later, we're going to talk about how we protect these openings in the gates, so to speak. But that is one of the big physical factors. Now, let's talk about your eyes. Your eyes technically are part of your mucous membrane, so we're also going to talk about your mucous membrane. Your mucous membrane in your eyes, you can't have a thick dead layer, because part of the job of your eye is to have light pass through. So what happens is, with your cornea, you have tear glands, your lacrimal glands, and they're up in this corner. You have a few down here. They produce tears that the blinking of your eyes, sweep them over into your tear ducts, goes down into your nose, okay, into your sinuses. Now tears are clear. We can't have a big old glob of mucus on there. When you get an eye infection, you know how hard it is to see through that. But the physical action of the tears continually going one way across your eye keeps a constant flow, and if you have microbes or dirt or dust hit your eye, it's constantly being flushed through, and that's a physical factor in keeping your eyes free of infection. Now, let's talk about your sinuses once the tears hit your sinuses. Your mucous membranes are different from your skin in that the outside layer is usually 1 or 2 cells thick. They're not dead. They're not keratinized, because one of the jobs of your mucous membranes is to absorb. It's on the inside of your body. You want to keep it moist, and especially in your digestive tract, you're wanting to absorb nutrients. In your sinuses, in the area that's related to your sense of smell, you're wanting to absorb scent molecules so that you can smell. So what we have instead, because we can't waterproof your mucous membrane, we produce mucus. It is a sticky peptidoglycan. It's a protein with some sugars attached. So anything that comes in, whether it's a dust particle, a microbe, whatever, gets stuck in the mucus, and then you have cells with a lot of cilia on the outside of them. And that cilia beats and moves the mucus and anything that's trapped in it up and out of your respiratory tract, and then you swallow it, and that goes into your gastrointestinal tract. And when we talk about chemical factors, we're going to talk more about defenses related to that. Speaking of chemical factors, let's take a look at the body and let's talk about chemical factors. Now, some of these we've talked about before, and you're probably already familiar with them. But let's start in the oral area and go clear down through the digestive tract. So in your mouth, your salivary glands produce digestive enzymes. Their primary purpose is to digest food, but it also inhibits an awful lot of bacteria because they're getting digested. Then once things get swallowed, they hit the stomach, and what's in the stomach? Acid. Poor little microbes, even those that are in the sinuses and get swallowed down, they hit this big old acid bath. There's not a whole lot of organisms that can survive this acid bath. Now, remember back to chapter 2. Yes, the infamous chapter 2. What does a low pH do to proteins, whether structural or enzymatic? It denatures them. That's why most of your microbes die. But remembering back to chapter 6 about growth requirements, there are some organisms that, one, like a low pH, and there's not very many of them. They have a tendency to live in your stomach. Later on we'll talk about organisms like Helicobacter pylori, which is a causative agent of gastric ulcers. And some of them are acid resistant. They survive passage through the stomach. They don't particularly like the low pH, but they can survive it to get to where they want to be, which is in the intestines. So you have a lot of microbes up here because we've got beginning digestive enzymes, but we've got a fairly neutral pH. Not a lot survives the stomach. Some organisms survive passage through the stomach because they're protected by globs of food. They're inside the food. And then once you get to your small intestines, your gallbladder and your liver, well, your liver produces other enzymes and also bile salts and different things that neutralize the acid when it hits your small intestines, because your small intestines have proteins that don't need to be denatured either. So in your small intestines you have an awful lot of microbes. You have most of them in your large intestines, but we have an awful lot of digestive enzymes that can inhibit the growth of some organisms. Others say this is wonderful. Also, this is going back to physical. Generally speaking, we have passage of food and other things one way through the body. Now, one thing that can help is if you are sick with a gastrointestinal disease, you can move things up and out so that they don't go through the small intestines, getting them out the shorter way, i.e. vomiting. Okay, let's briefly talk about skin. Your sweat glands produce sweat, and when that dries, what does that do to your skin? Makes it salty. So you have osmotic pressure that decreases the kinds of microbes that can live on your skin. Those microbes that can live on your skin are halotolerant. See all of these chapters that we went over before? They're coming together. Also, you don't produce just sweat. You produce oils, sebum, and your oil glands produce sebum to keep your skin soft and flexible. You don't want to be cracking and breaking. That lets microbes in. But sebum is also full of antimicrobial substances. Lowers the pH of your skin, makes it a little more acidic, and there's also molecules that specifically are antimicrobial. Okay, so those are all chemical factors with a few physical factors thrown in. Now let's talk about all of these microbes that are living on the outside of you and on the inside of you. Anything that stays for longer than 6 months is considered your normal microbiota. Most of these organisms that are living in symbiosis with you are engaged in commensalism. Some of them are mutualistic, they're actively benefiting you, but most of them are commensal, they're doing no harm. What they do, at least the current theory is, they're competing with potential pathogens for nutrients, space to live, water, okay? So that lowers the possibility of you having a pathogen get a hold, use their adhesions to attach, because they have to get through the layer of your normal microbiota. Now, some of these commensal organisms are opportunistic pathogens. They're not a problem where they're supposed to be, but if they get inside of your body, say into your blood system or into your deeper tissues, then they cause disease. So in other words, They're okay unless you turn your back on them, and then they will smack you upside the head and mug you. So definitely not as bad as your dedicated pathogens, but you do want to keep your eye on them. All right, let's talk about the formed elements in the blood. These are the thick things. These are the things that are solid, i.e. cells. So most of the formed elements of your blood are erythrocytes or red blood cells. That's mostly what you have in your blood. Now, these are not a part of your immune system, but we have to include them when we talk about formed elements in the blood, because otherwise you'd be going, hey, wait a minute, what about erythrocytes? Okay, now let's talk about your white blood cells, or your leukocytes. Now, they come in two flavors. You have your granulocytes and you have your agranulocytes. Granulocytes have granules in their cytoplasm that you can see with a light microscope. Agranulocytes do have granules, but they're too small to see with a light microscope, so we say that they are A or no granules. Okay, so with your granulocytes, you have three kinds. You have your neutrophils, so that when you stain them with an acidic stain and a basic stain, they will stain with both. So we call those neutrophils. Now, their main job is phagocytosis. They engulf foreign invaders. Now, I also like to talk about NETs, neutrophil extracellular traps. They don't do this very often, but when things get really bad, when there's a whole lot of pathogens and they just can't eat them fast enough, what they do is they explode. They mix the contents of their granules into their chromosome, their DNA strands, and those DNA strands act like the strands of a net. And they explode, casting this toxin-laced net over the pathogens and innocent bystander cells, and those granules that are embedded in the DNA kill them. So you don't want neutrophils exploding, but when things are really bad, it helps to take out large numbers of pathogens all at once, and you can replace the innocent bystander cells. Now, we're going to talk about this again when we talk about chronic inflammation. Let's move on to basophils. Basophils, when you stain them with a basic stain, their granules will stain. That's why we call them basophils. Now, going back to chapter 2, what is the actual pH of those granules if a basic or positively charged stain will attach to them? They're negative. Yes, they're mostly acidic. Now, their main job is to produce histamine. Now, another name for basophils are mast cells, and we're going to talk more about basophils / mast cells when we talk about the chapter on inappropriate immune responses, i.e. allergies. Okay, but what histamine does is it stimulates inflammation. It's a cytokine. It recruits other immune cells, neutrophils, monocytes, etc. Okay, now you have your eosinophils. The granules, stain when you put the negative stain, eosin, on. That's why we call them eosinophils. Now, what is the actual pH of their granules? Okay, because they stain with an acidic stain, they're actually basic. Now, their main function is productions of proteins against certain parasites. That's what those granules are full of. They do some phagocytosis, but they mainly leave it to the neutrophils. Okay, so eosinophils, you will see an increase of those when you have a multicellular parasitic infection. We're going to talk about that more in the next chapter, but basically what they do is they attach themselves to these huge multicellular parasites. There's no way that they can phagocytize them down, and they drop little bombs on them and kill the parasite that way. Now, on to agranulocytes, monocytes. We're going to be talking an awful lot about monocytes. Monocytes are cells that their main job is phagocytosis when they mature into macrophages. Monocytes float around through the blood and the lymph. They're just kind of cruising along, checking out the body, seeing where they want to live eventually. Then when they come upon the site of an infection, when their toll-like receptors respond to PAMPs, they mature into macrophages that their main job is phagocytosis, eating those things that have a PAMF, and they stay in that spot. So they settle down, take a job, buy a house. Okay. Then they develop all sorts of specific names depending upon where they are. Now, one of the specific names that we're going to be referring to a lot are dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are associated with the skin and mucous membrane, and they have these long extensions that kind of look like the dendrites on a neuron. That's why we call them dendritic cells. They kind of look like dendrites. So they phagocytize, and because they have those long extensions, they can keep watch over a large area directly below your first line of defense. Now we're going to move on to lymphocytes. Lymphocytes have huge nuclei. When you're looking at them under the microscope, that's one way to identify them. There are 3 types. 2 of them we're going to talk more about in the next chapter, T cells and B cells, because their main job is a part of the adaptive immune system. Now let's talk about lymphocytes that are part of the innate immunity, and those are natural killer cells. They go along looking for things that aren't right with your cells. If they're not producing the right antigens, your cells produce antigens too, and they display them on the surface of their cells. So basically think of it as the cells. They're little factories, and they display on their surfaces an advertisement of what they're currently making. Well, if they're currently making viral proteins, those viral proteins are going to be displayed on the surface of the cell. It's kind of like, help, we've been taken over. And the natural killer cells will come along and say, you're not making what you're supposed to. You're probably virally infected, or maybe you're a cancer cell because you're not making what you're supposed to. And then they will kill them. So that's why we call them natural killer cells. They look for PAMPs, things that aren't right, on the surface of your cells. Now, to finish out our formed elements, you have platelets, which are not involved in the immune system except for forming blood clots. When you get a break in the skin, you've got to stop the bleeding, and platelets do that. You seal the breach, no more microbes can get in, you can't lose any more fluid. And as you remember from previous chapters, some pathogens take advantage of platelets to hide from your white blood cells, specifically your neutrophils and your monocytes, your macrophages. Okay, so those are the formed elements of the blood. Now we're going to talk about your lymphatic system. It kind of works with your circulatory system, so let's also talk about your circulatory system. Okay, your circulatory system, you're familiar with the heart. The heart pumps blood away through your body, and then it comes back in through your veins, and then your heart pumps it through again. It picks up oxygen through your lungs. Okay, now when you get to the capillaries, where your veins and your arteries branch off into smaller vessels that we call capillaries, you get leaking of the fluid part of your blood out to bathe your tissues. They're taking nutrients, they're taking oxygen, and they pick up waste, and they pick up CO2. Now that needs to get back into your blood, into your circulatory system, but while it's in between your cells, we call it interstitial fluid. When it's returning back to your circulatory system, we call it lymph. Now you have lymphatic capillaries that dump into your lymphatic vessels, and eventually up by the top of your heart dumps back into your circulatory system. Now, because it's picking up waste and it's bringing it back to be filtered by your kidneys for the CO2 to be exhaled by your lungs, this is a good time to check for pathogens that might be hiding out within your tissues. So your lymph gets filtered by lymph nodes that are full of immune cells that are looking for PAMPs and for antigens, non-self antigens. And your lymphatic tissue, you have lymph nodes at your armpits, your groin, you have lymphatic tissue that are through your small intestines and your large intestines. Okay. Your tonsils, they are considered lymphoid tissue because they have all of these immune cells that are checking what's going past, looking for hazards. So that is your lymphatic system. That is a part of your immune system.
Well, that's it for these 2 topics. As a reminder of what I want you to keep in mind while you're watching these recorded lectures and while you're reading the textbook, I want you to be able to summarize what the 3 lines of defense are, identify 3 components of the first line of defense, define marker and discuss its importance in the second and third lines of defense, name 4 body compartments that participate in immunity, list the components of the reticular endothelial system, define the structure and function of the lymphatic system, name 3 kinds of blood cells that function in nonspecific immunity and the most important function of each, and name 2 kinds of lymphocytes involved in specific immunity.